The Viking Age remains one of the most captivating chapters of medieval history, kept alive today by popular television dramatizations and even the naming of an American football team, yet the popular imagination is built on a foundation of myths that deserve correction before any real understanding can begin, starting with the most persistent one of all. Contrary to almost every cartoon and costume ever produced, Vikings never wore horned helmets, an image that was actually invented in the 19th century by a costume designer working on Richard Wagner's operatic Ring Cycle in the 1870s, who simply thought horns and wings looked dramatic on stage, and no archaeological dig from the actual Viking period has ever turned up a helmet with horns attached. Since real Norse warriors wore practical iron or leather headgear, and horns would have been a dangerous liability in close combat, easily struck by a sword or snagged on branches while moving through forest terrain. The true story begins at the close of the 8th century, when people from the regions we now call Denmark, Norway, and Sweden began pushing outward from Scandinavia in growing numbers, driven by some combination of overcrowding, a shortage of marriageable women, and tailies of the riches held by Christian kingdoms to the south, all compounded by the fact that Scandinavia, despite its size, was a demanding and resource-poor homeland that pushed its people toward the sea in search of opportunity. And it's worth stressing that there was never a single unified Viking nation or empire, but rather three distinct cultural spheres that shared language, religion, and periodic alliances while pursuing very different paths. The Norwegians, shaped by dramatic fjords and a rugged coastline, became master seafarers who colonized the Faroe Islands, Iceland, and Greenland before eventually reaching North America. The Swedes, blessed with flatter, more fertile land and a position facing the Baltic Sea, turned their energy toward the river systems of Eastern Europe, becoming known there as the Rus and establishing deep trading and cultural connections with the Byzantine Empire and the Caspian region, eventually lending their name to modern Russia. And the Danes, occupying flat and fertile terrain ideal for farming, built the earliest and most politically stable of the three Scandinavian monarchies, channeling their energy primarily toward raiding and settling in Western Europe and the British Isles, with borders between these groups remaining fluid throughout the era, marked by shifting alliances, conflicts, intermarriage, and shared cultural threads that wove the wider Norse world together. Even the word Viking itself is something of a misnomer, since the people we call by that name never used it as a collective ethnic label for themselves. In Old Norse, Vikingur referred to a person who went on an overseas expedition, and Viking described the act of going on such a voyage, terms found carved into runestones and preserved in poetry, and it was only later in the medieval sagas written centuries afterward that the word picked up its darker connotation of piracy and predation, while contemporaries were just as likely to refer to Scandinavians simply as Norsemen, speakers of the Old Norse tongue, and it's doubtful that many people living in 11th century Norway would have identified themselves as Norwegian or Viking at all, more likely defining themselves by family lineage or local district instead. Central to Viking success at sea was a genuine engineering triumph. The longship, whose lineage stretched back to simple oared canoes of the Bronze and early Iron Age, refined over centuries through the addition of a keel and rudder that gave the vessels newfound stability, permitting the addition of sails and the widening of the hull, innovations exemplified by the Gokstad ship discovered in Norway in 1920, and these vessels came in a range of sizes categorized largely by how many oars they carried. From small trading and utility boats with just a handful of oar positions up through mid-sized craft with a dozen or more, all the way to formidable warships bristling with 20 or 30 rowing stations, with the largest longship ever excavated, unearthed at Roskilde in 1997, having space for roughly 40 rowers, though later medieval sagas describe even larger dragon ships, for which no archaeological confirmation has ever surfaced. These ships were built for speed above all, with a slender, symmetrical hull that let crews reverse direction rapidly without needing to turn around. And while sailing technology had existed around the Mediterranean since roughly 3000 BCE, its adoption in Scandinavia around the 8th century remains something of a puzzle, though once incorporated it transformed Viking mobility, letting a ship travel from Norway to the English coast in under a week when conditions were favorable and top speeds could reach around 15 knots. Even though producing a single sail was an enormous undertaking, requiring roughly 75 kilograms of wool sheared from about 150 sheep and years of labor to weave. Another key advantage was the clinker-built construction method, in which overlapping planks produced a hull that was both lighter and faster to build than contemporary techniques, and the shallow draft of these ships meant they could navigate rivers as shallow as a single meter, beach directly on open shorelines for surprise raids, and in some cases be hauled overland between waterways, a crucial advantage for river-based trade and raiding throughout Eastern Europe. How exactly Norse sailors made it across the treacherous North Atlantic to Greenland and eventually North America remains partly mysterious, since they possessed no compass or maps in the modern sense and instead relied on tracking the sun, stars, and ocean currents, along with an uncertain and archaeologically unproven tradition of using so-called sunstones to locate the sun's position through cloud cover. Managing to navigate latitude with real precision even while longitude remained essentially unsolvable for them. Credit for the first crossing to North America traditionally goes to the Icelandic explorer Leif Erikson, who, according to the Saga of Erik the Red, was blown off course while sailing toward Greenland and instead landed in a region he called Vinland after the wild grapes growing there, a site widely associated with the Norse settlement of Elant's Ox Meadows in Newfoundland, discovered by Norwegian archaeologists in the 1960s, which appears to have functioned as a temporary staging post for further southward exploration rather than a permanent colony, since it contains no burials, no church, and only a handful of structures suited to sheltering a few boat crews and their supplies. The broader success of Norse expansion during this period was likely aided by an unusually warm climatic phase lasting from roughly the 10th through the early 14th century, which kept northern seas freer of ice and made long-distance voyaging more feasible. Unfortunately, the physical evidence for all of this remains frustratingly sparse, since wooden ships rot away within centuries unless preserved by unusual conditions. The first Viking longship wasn't even excavated until 1867, and written records from the era are similarly scarce, since the period falls within what's traditionally labeled the Dark Ages due to the relative absence of contemporary documentation following Rome's collapse, though many historians now consider that label overly dismissive. The richest surviving written sources, the Icelandic sagas, were composed roughly 2 centuries after the events they describe, transmitted for generations through oral storytelling before being written down far from where much of the raiding actually occurred, meaning they blend genuine historical memory with entertainment and embellishment, as in the legendary tale of Ragnar Lothbrok slaying giant serpents, a story whose subject may not have even existed as a single historical figure. Yet these narratives still offer historians valuable clues about how Norse society functioned that can be cross-checked against the archaeological record. Fortunately, modern scientific techniques are steadily filling in the gaps, with isotope analysis of tooth enamel now allowing researchers to trace where individuals grew up based on the chemical signatures absorbed during childhood, since strontium and oxygen isotopes specific to a person's home geography become locked into forming teeth and remain detectable even 1,000 years after death. While satellite imagery helps locate new archaeological sites and improved radiocarbon dating sharpens the chronology of finds, European chroniclers writing from the receiving end of Viking raids, most notably the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle begun under King Alfred the Great's court in the late 9th century, provide another crucial but inherently biased source, since these accounts were written almost exclusively by churchmen describing attacks on their own religious institutions, making genuine objectivity unlikely even if the underlying brutality they describe was real. That chronicle famously marks the year 793 as the dawn of the Viking Age, the year Norse raiders struck the undefended monastery of Lindisfarne off the coast of Northumbria, an assault the chronicle describes with apocalyptic imagery of whirlwinds, lightning, and fiery dragons in the sky, embellishments that shouldn't obscure the very real violence of the raid itself, in which the monks discovered that their attackers cared nothing for sacred texts and instead wanted gold, silver, and captives to enslave, an assault so shocking that it reverberated all the way to the court of Charlemagne, where the scholar Alcuin of York recorded the horror. This attack occurred amid broader historical currents, since the collapse of the Western Roman Empire centuries earlier had left Europe fragmented into weaker kingdoms unable to maintain strong defensive forces, and by the 8th century a genuine economic boom had enriched coastal trading settlements across what's now England, France, and the Low Countries, even as Norwegian communities, geographically sidelined from this prosperity, began noticing just how poorly defended these wealthy, undefended ports actually were. The raids that followed Lindisfarne escalated steadily, striking the nearby monastery at Jarrow within a year, and by the second half of the 9th century Viking assaults had grown far more organized and ambitious, epitomized by the arrival of the so-called Great Heathen Army from Denmark in 865, a force of uncertain size likely in the low thousands that began systematically conquering territory across northeastern England, eventually suffering defeat at the hands of Alfred the Great at the Battle of Edington in 878, though the resulting treaty still ceded control of a substantial swath of northeastern England, later known as the Danelaw, to Danish rule, with Danes subsequently settling throughout the region. In the early 10th century, the Danish-Norwegian king Sweyn Forkbeard launched repeated invasions and eventually claimed the English throne outright, succeeded by his son Sinet the Great, who ruled a North Sea empire spanning England, Norway, and Denmark, and it wasn't until 1042 that the crown passed back to the Anglo-Saxon line under Edward the Confessor, though the Viking legacy in England didn't truly end there, since William the Conqueror, who seized the throne in 1066, was himself descended from Norse settlers in Normandy. Meanwhile, Norse raiders had also been active across the English Channel in what is now northern France, especially after Charlemagne's death in 814 plunged his empire into civil war, providing an opening that Viking forces exploited through a major raid up the Seine in 820, culminating in the Siege of Paris in 845 under a Norse leader named Ragnar, possibly the historical inspiration behind the Ragnar Lothbrok legend, who was ultimately paid off by King Charles the Bald to withdraw. Norse forces continued operating in West Francia, seizing the city of Rouen in 876, and besieging Paris again in 885 with a force said to number some 300 longships, effectively occupying the region of Normandy, until its leader Rollo agreed to swear allegiance to King Charles III, becoming the first ruler of the Normans, the eventual descendants of these Viking settlers who would go on to play an outsized role in later European history. Viking forces also cultivated a fearsome reputation through the supposed existence of berserkers, elite warriors said to fight in states of uncontrollable battle rage, with popular legend attributing this to the consumption of hallucinogenic mushrooms, a claim for which there is, in fact, absolutely no archaeological or historical evidence whatsoever. On the Eastern Front, Swedish Vikings known as the Rus had been making crossings of the Baltic Sea into what is now Russia, founding the settlement that would become Kievan Rus in 882 under the descendants of the semi-legendary Prince Rurik, with Norse settlements eventually stretching from the Black Sea up toward Finland, and these eastern ventures tended to emphasize trade over outright plunder. Building an extensive commercial network stretching from Spain and Sicily in the west to trading hubs in Sweden like Birka and Gotland, then across the Baltic into the great river systems leading toward the Volga and the Dnieper, all the way down to Constantinople, which the Norse referred to as Miklagard, the great city, maintaining such close ties with the Byzantine world that Norse warriors, including the future Norwegian King Harald Hardrada, served in the emperor's elite personal bodyguard known as the Varangian Guard. From Byzantium, Rus traders could connect eastward with the Abbasid Caliphate and from there link into the Silk Road stretching all the way to China, exchanging homegrown goods like amber, wool, furs, fish, and walrus ivory, sometimes marketed to unsuspecting buyers as unicorn horn, for imported luxuries including wine, spices, silk, and ceramics, though above all the Norse craved silver. Operating what's known as a bullion economy in which value was determined not by minted coinage, but by the weight and purity of metal, with traders using scales and sharp tools to test and measure silver on the spot, a system dramatically illustrated by a hoard of some 200 silver pieces, including Islamic coins, discovered at Silverdale in England in 2011, underscoring just how far this trading network extended. Though the flow of Islamic silver into Scandinavia largely dried up after 965 when Middle Eastern silver mines were exhausted. This same trading system had a darker side rooted in the systematic buying and selling of enslaved people, often captured during raids and transported back to Scandinavia, occasionally sold onward into Western Europe, though more commonly traded within Scandinavia, Eastern Europe, and Middle Eastern markets like Baghdad, with the scale of this trade in Eastern Europe so significant that the very word slave is thought to derive from Slav. In the 9th century, representing a particular high point for this traffic before an oversupply in the following century caused prices in Islamic markets to collapse. Overall, more archaeological evidence survives of Viking activity to the east than to the west, suggesting this Eastern trading legacy, credited with helping revive the European economy after Rome's fall, may ultimately have been more significant than the raiding for which the Vikings are best remembered. Back home in Scandinavia, society remained largely rural and dispersed across farmsteads and small villages rather than towns, particularly in the politically unstable and often lawless early part of the era, when power was concentrated locally around individual chieftains, though the region was notably less violent internally than the areas Vikings targeted abroad, and the late 10th century brought growing political centralization as the national kingdoms of Norway, Sweden, and Denmark took shape alongside modest urban growth. Norse society was structured into three broad classes, vividly described in the medieval poem known as the List of Rig, with the Jarls forming an aristocratic elite roughly equivalent to English earls, often serving as community chieftains wealthy enough to fund shipbuilding and expeditions, and to preside over local governing assemblies called things, institutions with roots reaching back to at least the 1st century CE, including Iceland's Althing. Established in 930 and often cited as the world's oldest continuously operating parliament, beneath the Jarls were the Carls or free people, who made up the bulk of the population, working as farmers, traders, craftspeople, and sometimes warriors, forming the backbone of raiding parties when not occupied with agriculture. And at the bottom sat the thralls, enslaved individuals typically captured during raids who performed hard labor and could be bought, sold, or traded, though some managed to earn or be granted freedom, with women and children believed to have made up the majority of this enslaved population, some kept as concubines by wealthier men, and estimates suggesting as much as 10% of the Scandinavian population may have lived in bondage during this era. Free women, meanwhile, appear to have enjoyed relatively significant social standing compared to many contemporary societies, frequently portrayed in saga literature as strong, intelligent figures commanding real respect, even though the Old Norse term for Viking itself technically applied only to men, and most free women's daily lives centered on housework, farming, and food production, taking over management of the farmstead entirely while husbands were away on expeditions. Notably, women in Norse society could initiate divorce, with grounds including poverty, domestic violence, or prolonged abandonment, and while women typically stayed behind during short raiding expeditions, evidence suggests they frequently accompanied men on longer voyages intended for settlement, such as the colonization of Iceland and parts of England and France, raising the ongoing question of whether women ever took up arms themselves. A possibility hinted at by some burial evidence and by saga references to so-called shield maidens and the mythical Valkyries, though the mere presence of weapons in a woman's grave doesn't automatically confirm she fought in battle, and while women almost certainly participated in combat at some point across 3 centuries of Norse history, it was likely far from a common occurrence. Religiously, pre-Christian Norse society followed a polytheistic, animistic tradition centered on a pantheon led by Odin and including familiar figures like Thor and Loki, alongside Freya, goddess of love, beauty, and gold, believed to travel in a chariot pulled by cats, all set within a cosmology of 9 interconnected worlds joined by the great world tree Yggdrasil, with the human realm known as Midgard, a concept that later inspired J.R.R. Tolkien's Middle-earth. This belief system placed heavy emphasis on fate and heroic death in battle, with half of those who died fighting believed to be carried by the Valkyries to Odin's Hall of Valhalla and the other half taken by Freya to her own field, a worldview that may well have fueled Norse boldness in warfare and exploration alike. Even as Christian writers dismissed these beliefs as pagan superstition, and pointed to genuine, if likely exaggerated evidence of animal and occasional human sacrifice within Norse ritual practice. By the close of the 10th century, however, Christianity had made deep inroads across Scandinavia, symbolized by the runestones at Jelling in Denmark, where King Harald Bluetooth, who ruled from 958 to 986, raised a stone commemorating his role in converting the Danish people, a king whose name would later be borrowed for the short-range wireless technology that now connects countless modern devices. This religious shift proved pivotal to the Viking Age's eventual decline, since Christian conversion opened the door to diplomatic integration with the rest of Christian Europe and reduced the frequency of raiding, while the consolidation of stronger, more centralized kingdoms throughout England and Scandinavia made these territories increasingly difficult targets. In England, the Viking Age is generally considered to have effectively ended in 1066. When King Harold defeated the Norwegian King Harald Hardrada at the Battle of Stamford Bridge. Even though Harold was himself defeated shortly afterward by William the Conqueror, a Norman descended from earlier Viking settlers, meaning the Norse legacy persisted even as direct Viking incursions faded. Sporadic Viking raids continued in Britain afterward, but never again posed a serious threat of outright conquest, and looking back across the full sweep of the period, it becomes clear the Vikings were far more than the raiders and plunderers of popular memory, since Scandinavian settlers intermingled extensively with local populations wherever they went, leaving descendants who occupied the English throne for generations and permanently shaped the English language. Established lasting colonies in Iceland and Greenland, became the first Europeans to reach North America roughly 5 centuries before Columbus, and built extensive trading networks across Europe and Asia that helped rejuvenate the continental economy and laid groundwork for later medieval commerce and population growth. Archaeological discoveries continue to deepen and complicate this picture, none more strikingly than the excavation of a mass burial on the Estonian island of Saaremaa in 2011, where road construction uncovered the remains of more than 40 individuals in 2 boat graves, their skeletons bearing brutal evidence of violent death including hacked limbs and multiple battle wounds. Initially assumed to date from the classic Viking period, but ultimately radiocarbon dated to a period roughly a century before the traditionally recognized start of the Viking Age at Lindisfarne, even though the weapons, ship construction, and grave goods clearly identified the dead as Scandinavian, suggesting organized Norse seaborne activity considerably earlier than previously believed. Similarly revealing work in Russia has shown that Scandinavian traders and warriors were active along the Volga River system, and around trading centers like Sturla well before Norse activity was ever recorded in Western chronicles, with tree-ring dating of wooden artifacts, including sticks inscribed with runic writing, confirming a Scandinavian presence in the region predating the conventional Viking Age timeline. Further north, on Shetland, archaeological evidence shows Norse settlers reusing existing Pictish dwellings after arriving sometime in the 8th century, though what exactly happened to the indigenous Pictish population who previously lived there remains unclear, with researchers suggesting initial contact likely began through trade before an uncertain transition toward more aggressive settlement. Back in England, ongoing excavation in York's Hungate district has complicated the traditional narrative of a clean divide between Anglo-Saxon and Scandinavian populations, since finds their point to a genuinely blended cosmopolitan society rather than two neatly separate cultural groups, a pattern echoed at the site of Repton, where roughly 250 skeletons, mostly male, were discovered clustered around a central grave dated to 873. The same year, a major Viking leader died there, alongside nearby burial mounds suggesting a military cemetery for the great heathen army. The political turbulence of the era also produced striking forensic discoveries in later centuries, including 18 skeletons unearthed at St. John's College, Oxford in 2012, initially linked to the infamous St. Brice's Day massacre of 1002, when the English king ordered the killing of Danes living in his kingdom, with isotope analysis of the victims' teeth suggesting origins consistent with Scandinavian ancestry and a colder climate than southern England. While healed blade wounds on several skeletons hinted these men had prior combat experience, suggesting they were professional warriors or raiders rather than ordinary farmers caught up in violence, a pattern mirrored by a similar mass grave discovered near Weymouth. A further isolated skeleton found beneath Coppergate in York, bearing multiple blade wounds, offers a poignant if ultimately unsolvable mystery about the specific violence that claimed this individual's life during an era when brutal death was disturbingly common. These discoveries collectively challenge older, tidier narratives that separated distinct ethnic groups into rigid boxes, instead revealing a far more interconnected, hybridized medieval world where identity was fluid and often defined more by local ties and family lineage than by simple national labels. Eastward expansion continued well into the 11th century, exemplified by the extraordinary and largely doomed expedition of Ingvar the Far-Traveled, who led roughly 1,000 Swedish warriors deep into what is now Georgia around 1040 in search of plunder, a campaign commemorated by some 26 surviving runestones in Sweden, though only a single ship is believed to have returned home safely from the expedition. Illustrating both the astonishing geographic reach of Norse ambition and its very real costs. Ultimately, the most enduring myth about the Vikings that they were uniquely bloodthirsty pirates who always triumphed in battle and feared nothing obscures a more nuanced truth. They lived through a genuinely violent age, no more and no less brutal than many of their contemporaries, and the arrival of the year 1000 marked not the end of Norse influence but a turning point, as the era of small independent raiding chieftains gave way to powerful centralized Viking kings who commanded whole nations and unleashed even greater bloodshed against England and each other than earlier generations had ever managed. Professional mercenary armies came to dominate both Eastern and Western Europe, and the political and military leaders who emerged from this era absorbed lessons in statecraft from their rivals and adversaries that ultimately helped construct the foundations of European kingdoms that, in various forms, endure to this very day.